The house smelled like dust and lavender when I first walked in. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The porcelain figurines on the mantel, the heavy curtains pulled halfway shut, and that faint scent of her favorite perfume that somehow refused to fade. My mother had been gone for 2 months, and yet the house still breathed her name. I wasn't sure why I came back. Maybe out of guilt, or duty, or that strange pull that comes when you realize you're the last one left to close a story. The realtor told me I could sell it as is, but something inside me said I had to go through everything first. Maybe I was afraid that if I didn't, I'd lose her for good. The kitchen was the hardest. It was where she'd always stood, scolding me for being late, offering me food I never had time to eat. Now, the silence there felt heavier than her words ever did. I opened a drawer and found a stack of old envelopes, letters she had written but never sent. Most of them were addressed to my uncle and aunt, people we hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't need to read them to know what they said. Accusations, probably. Resentments that never found air. That's how it always was with her. Nothing forgiven, just buried under layers of quiet. In her bedroom, everything was still in order. Her jewelry box sat open on the dresser, but most of the pieces were gone, probably given away or sold long before her health declined. In the nightstand drawer, I found a small leather-bound notebook. It looked older than me, with a cracked spine and yellowed pages. On the cover, in her careful handwriting, was written, "For whoever finds this after I'm gone." I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it. The first page was dated 1999. They think I've forgotten, but I haven't. You don't forget betrayal. You just learn to live with the weight of it. Her handwriting was firm, almost angry. Page after page, she wrote about family arguments, whispered deals, lies she said she'd overheard. She described my father, too, how he'd sided with them in the end, how she never forgave him for it. I read until my eyes blurred. There were names, events, accusations that made no sense to me, but the emotion was undeniable. It wasn't just bitterness, it was pain, a kind that never left her, that turned her into someone I couldn't always love but could never truly hate. That night, I stayed in her old room, unable to sleep. I could hear the faint ticking of her wall clock, the same one that used to drive her crazy when she couldn't rest. The journal lay beside me, and though I wanted to stop reading, I couldn't. The next entries were more personal. She wrote about me, about how I stopped calling, how she kept waiting. "He'll come around," she wrote. "He's my son. He has my stubbornness." I shut the book, suddenly ashamed. I told myself we'd simply grown apart, that life got in the way. But reading her words, I realized she'd noticed everything, every silence, every distance. The next morning, sunlight fell across the old photo frames on her dresser. There we were, me at 10, her with that half-smile she used to hide behind when things were hard. I touched the glass, then looked at the notebook again. Beneath it, tucked under some old receipts, was another journal, newer, with a red ribbon marking the middle. Its first page began, "If you're reading this, I guess you're the one who stayed." She had written it in her last year, judging by the dates. The tone was calmer, almost resigned. She spoke of forgiveness, of learning to let go of the house, the money, the grudges. "They all took something from me," she wrote. "But I took something too, their peace. And maybe that's why I can't find mine." For the first time, I saw her not as the difficult woman everyone avoided, but as someone who'd carried too much. Maybe the house wasn't cursed, like she used to say. Maybe it was just heavy, with everything left unsaid. I spent the next few hours cleaning. Each object felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. When I found a sealed envelope with my name on it, I almost didn't open it. Inside, there was just a single line written in her familiar blue ink. "Take care of the house, but don't let it own you." I sat there for a long time, holding that letter. For the first time, I didn't feel angry or guilty, just tired and strangely at peace. I didn't know then that the hardest part was still ahead, that the more I read, the more I'd learned she'd been right about almost everything, and wrong in the one way that mattered most. For the next 2 days, I stayed in the house, reading and sorting through what she'd left behind. It was strange. Every drawer, every box held traces of her battles. Receipts from lawyers, scribbled notes about phone calls she never returned, and lists of people she swore had taken something from her. But it wasn't just obsession. Underneath the anger, I could sense the loneliness, A woman trying to make sense of a world that kept disappointing her. The second journal, the newer one, became my focus. I read it cover to cover, each page peeling away layers of my own ignorance. She wrote about the family inheritance, how after my father's death, she'd fought with her siblings over the land, the old family house, and a sum of money that none of them actually needed. It wasn't about the money, she wrote. It was about who was right. And maybe that's worse. I didn't know all the details back then. I was too young to understand why we stopped visiting my cousins, why every holiday turned into an argument. But now, seeing it from her point of view, it was clear that the feud had consumed her life. What surprised me most was how much she blamed herself. I turned every wound into a weapon, one entry said. And when there was no one left to fight, I aimed it at myself. There was something almost confessional in those words, as if she'd written them for me, or for anyone willing to understand her side of the story. One evening, while I was sorting through the attic, I found an old chest locked with a rusted padlock. It took me nearly half an hour to break it open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all from my aunt, the one she'd accused most often in her writing. Their correspondence was messy, filled with apologies that came too late and forgiveness that never arrived. I sat on the floor, reading them under the dim light of a single bulb. One letter stood out. It was dated 5 years ago. I don't know what we're fighting for anymore, my aunt had written. It's not about the land or the money. I think we just don't know how to stop. That line hit me hard, because it wasn't just their story, it was mine too. I'd inherited the same silence, the same stubborn pride. For years, I hadn't called, hadn't written, convincing myself it didn't matter. But sitting there, surrounded by their ghosts, I finally saw the truth. Every fight in this family had the same ending. Nobody won, and everyone left a little emptier. I spent the next morning walking through the garden. The weeds had taken over, the stone path cracked and uneven. My mother used to love this place before everything fell apart. I could almost hear her voice telling me to trim the roses before they ruined themselves. It was a small thing, but I started to clean it up. Somehow it felt like the right way to start forgiving her, by fixing what she'd stopped caring about. Later that day, while flipping through the last few pages of her journal, I found a list titled, "If I Could Do It Again." It wasn't long, just 5 things. 1. I'd listen before I spoke. 2. I'd keep the letters, not the grudges. 3. I'd tell him I was proud. 4. I'd leave the house, not my heart, behind. 5. I'd forgive myself first. I didn't cry, not then, but something inside me softened. For the first time in years, I felt her presence not as a burden, but as a memory that finally wanted to rest. That evening, I drove into town and found my aunt's address. The last I'd heard, she still lived there alone. I didn't plan what to say, I just wanted to see her. When she opened the door, she froze. Her hair was grayer, her eyes smaller, but I recognized the same weariness that had lived in my mother. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said quietly. "Neither did I answered. We sat in her kitchen, the air thick with unspoken years. I told her about the journals, about the house, about how different Mom's words sounded now that she was gone. She listened without interrupting. When I showed her the letters, she took one and pressed it against her chest. "We were both cruel," she whispered. "But she was my sister. I never stopped loving her." I stayed for hours. We didn't fix everything. How could we? But for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. When I left, she handed me a small wooden box. "She gave this to me before things went bad," she said. "I was supposed to give it to you one day, but I didn't have the courage." Inside was a photo of me as a child, standing between them, both smiling in a way I hadn't seen in decades. Tucked behind the photo was another note in my mother's handwriting. "Don't let what broke us define you. Make something whole again." The next morning, I returned to the house and opened all the windows. The air outside was cool, crisp, and alive. I felt the walls breathe again, as if some invisible weight had lifted. I sat at the old desk and began to write in the back of her journal. Not to erase her words, but to continue them. "You were right," I wrote. "Some things can't be fixed, but they can be understood." I didn't know if I'd keep the house or sell it. That part didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that, for the first time, the silence inside those rooms didn't feel hostile, it felt calm. Maybe that was her way of saying goodbye. Or maybe it was mine. The following week passed in slow motion, like the house itself was reluctant to let go of me. Every morning, I woke up with sunlight spilling through the dusty curtains, painting faint lines across the wooden floorboards. The smell of old paper lingered everywhere, a scent of endings and things left unsaid. I began organizing the journals, not out of duty, but out of need. There were over 20 of them, scattered through drawers, closets, and boxes, each written in a different tone. Some were bitter, others tender, some trembling with anger, others with regret. It felt as if I were piecing together the anatomy of her soul. The first few I had already read. They covered the years of the inheritance battles. But deeper in the pile, I found older ones, from before I was born. Those pages were filled with her dreams, sketches of the garden she wanted, notes about books she planned to read, even recipes written in an elegant, youthful hand. It startled me to see her like that, alive, hopeful, curious. She had been someone else once, long before the bitterness took over. I found one journal from when she was pregnant with me. The handwriting was neater, rounder, and her words felt almost fragile. I don't know if I'll be a good mother, but I hope he grows up softer than I am. I closed the book and just sat there for a while, trying to imagine her not as the woman who raised me, but as a woman who once wanted to start over. The realization hurt more than I expected. That afternoon, I drove into town to buy cleaning supplies and boxes. The woman at the counter, Mrs. Klein, recognized me. "You're Margaret's boy," she said. "Haven't seen you in years." I nodded, half smiling. "Yeah, just taking care of the house." Her expression softened. She came in here a lot. Always bought the same coffee. Said it reminded her of someone. I didn't ask who. I just bought what I needed and left. Back at the house, I started cleaning the kitchen first, the one place that still smelled faintly of her cooking. Every drawer had small reminders, a faded grocery list, a broken measuring cup, a note taped to the fridge that read, "Remember to breathe." I laughed quietly at that. The sound echoed strangely, like the house wasn't used to laughter anymore. As evening fell, I made myself coffee and sat on the porch. The air carried the scent of rain and lilacs, just like the summers we used to spend here when I was a child. The silence wasn't as heavy as before. It was beginning to feel like a conversation, one where neither of us needed to speak. Later, I opened the final journal. It was different from the rest, leather-bound, smaller, with only a few pages filled in. The first line read, "If someone finds this, it means I've finally stopped writing." There was no bitterness this time, no blame. Just reflection. "I've spent years keeping records of what hurt me, thinking it would help me understand," she wrote. But understanding never came. Not until I accepted that pain doesn't need an audience. The next page was addressed to me directly. "If you're reading this, you've already seen too much of who I was. I hope you remember who I tried to be too." That line stopped me. She must have written it near the end, when she knew time was running out. I wanted to leave something behind. The letter continued. "Not money or property, but truth. You deserve to know the woman behind the walls. I wasn't kind enough, or brave enough, but I loved you more than I could ever say out loud. If you can, forgive me for being human." I didn't realize I was crying until a drop of water blurred the ink. I closed the journal, holding it tightly against my chest. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt both the weight of her absence and the warmth of her love at once, two things that somehow belonged together. The next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't planned. I invited my aunt and a few cousins to the house. It had been over 15 years since we'd all been under the same roof. They hesitated at first, unsure of my intentions, but curiosity won. They came. The moment they stepped inside, the tension was thick enough to taste. My aunt's eyes wandered across the walls, the furniture, the old photographs. "It hasn't changed," she murmured. "Except her," I said quietly. We sat around the dining table, the same one where so many arguments had started years ago. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, I placed the journals in the middle. "She wrote these," I said. "All of them. About everything that happened." My cousin rolled her eyes. "We don't need to reopen that mess." "Maybe not," I replied. "But maybe we need to finish it properly." I started reading aloud, just fragments, the softer ones, the ones where she questioned her choices instead of defending them. I saw their faces change as they listened. There was pain, yes, but also understanding. These weren't the words of a woman who wanted revenge. They were the words of someone who had lost herself trying to feel justified. When I finished, silence returned. Then my aunt reached out, touching one of the journals. I always thought she hated me, she whispered. She didn't, I said. She just didn't know how to stop fighting. Neither did I. We ended up staying for hours, talking about everything we'd buried under years of pride. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds too deep to close in one evening, but it was something. A beginning. When they left, my aunt hugged me tightly and said, she'd be proud of you. I didn't answer because I wasn't sure. But as I stood on the porch, watching their cars disappear down the road, I felt lighter than I had in years. That night, I sat by the window with the last journal open beside me. The pages fluttered slightly in the breeze. The house creaked softly, almost like it was exhaling. You were wrong about one thing, I whispered. You didn't leave only pain behind. I didn't know what would come next, whether I'd sell the place, rebuild it, or just let it stand as it was. But I knew I'd stopped carrying her anger. It no longer belonged to me. Before going to bed, I wrote one last line in her journal, beneath her final words, I forgive you. And I think I finally forgive myself, too. The next morning, the sunlight poured through the windows in golden streaks. Dust floated in the air like tiny pieces of memory. The garden outside shimmered with dew, and for the first time, the house didn't feel haunted by history. It felt alive with it. The days that followed carried a strange calm, like the air after a long storm. I stayed in the house longer than I'd planned, unable to explain why. Maybe it was because every morning I woke to the sound of the wind moving through the open windows, brushing against the curtains the same way it had when I was a child. Maybe because the house, despite its cracks and fading wallpaper, no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a confession that had finally been heard. I spent hours going through my mother's things, separating what to keep from what to let go. Some objects were easy, old dishes, worn-out clothes, receipts from years past. But then there were the small, quiet items that caught me off guard. The sweater she'd knitted but never finished, the postcards she'd bought but never sent, the old tape recorder with her voice still on it, humming an old song I barely remembered. I played it again and again, the static mixing with her soft voice until it sounded like time itself breathing. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't sell the house, not yet. It didn't feel right to hand it off to strangers, not when it finally felt like she was at peace here. Instead, I'd restore it, one room at a time. Not as a monument to her pain, but as a way to give it new meaning. I called a contractor the next morning, and as I walked through the rooms describing what needed fixing, I caught myself smiling at small details. The way the light hit the living room floor, the faint scent of coffee still lingering in the wood. When I reached the study, I stopped. The desk was still covered in her papers, and the journal I'd written in lay open. For a moment, I thought about closing it, but instead, I sat down and kept writing. Not about her, about me. About what it meant to carry someone's story and still find space for your own. The words came slowly at first, then all at once, as if the silence of the house had been waiting for this. By the time I finished, the sun had begun to set, flooding the room with a soft amber glow. I didn't read what I wrote. I didn't need to. It was enough to know it was there. Weeks passed, and the repairs began. The workers moved through the house, patching walls, replacing windows, sanding floors. I watched as layers of dust were lifted, as the rooms filled again with color and air. It was like the house was waking up from a long sleep. During one of those afternoons, my aunt came by again. She stood at the gate for a while before walking up the path, holding a tin box in her hands. I thought you might want this, she said. Inside were photographs, old ones I'd never seen. My mother and her, younger, smiling at a summer picnic, their arms around each other. There were others too. Me as a baby, my father with his arm around both of them, everyone laughing. It was strange how easily I could forget that they once knew joy. My aunt and I went inside and sat in the living room, looking through the photos together. She used to be the loudest one in the room, my aunt said with a faint smile. When she laughed, the whole house knew it. I laughed softly. I can't imagine that version of her. She buried it, my aunt said. After your father died, after the fight started, she just closed herself off. She paused, her eyes glistening. I think she thought that was strength. I nodded. She wasn't wrong, but maybe she went too far. We all did. She left the box with me when she went home. That night, I spread the photos across the floor and looked at each one carefully. It was like seeing ghosts in reverse, not haunting, but healing. Faces that once belonged to pain now shimmered with laughter, frozen in better days. I picked up one photo where I was sitting on my mother's lap, her hand resting gently on my head. The tenderness in her expression broke me. I whispered into the quiet, "You did your best. That's all I ever needed." The next morning, I took the journals and placed them in a drawer, not hidden, but safe. They no longer felt like burdens. They felt like proof of survival. I drove into town that afternoon and met with my aunt again. We talked about renovating the garden, turning it into a place the family could visit, not to remember the fights, but the love that had once lived there. She agreed. She'd like that, she said. Over the next few weeks, we worked together, planting, trimming, painting the old fence. My cousins came by on weekends, bringing their kids. There was laughter again, hesitant at first, then real. The first time I saw my aunt smile without restraint, I realized something beautiful. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It gives it new colors. One evening, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in the garden. The air was thick with the scent of rain and soil. The stars began to appear, one by one, above the roofline of the old house. I thought about how far we'd all come, from anger to quiet understanding. The wind brushed against the trees, carrying the faint sound of chimes from the porch. For a fleeting second, I could almost hear her humming again, that same old tune from the tape recorder. But this time, it didn't hurt. It felt like peace. I whispered, "We're okay now, Mom." And for the first time, I believed it. The following morning, I found an envelope on the porch, tucked under the door. It was from my aunt. Inside was a small note. I found one more thing of hers. Along with it was a faded photograph, my mother standing in front of the house years ago, holding a paintbrush, smiling wide. On the back, she'd written, "For whoever keeps this place alive, thank you." I smiled, folded the note, and slipped it into the final journal. The house stood quietly around me, its walls gleaming in the morning light. I realized then that homes, like people, don't heal overnight. They need time, care, and the courage to let light in where darkness once lived. I stepped outside and looked back one last time. The windows reflected the sky, and for a moment, I saw not the past, but a future, one that finally belonged to both of us. Rain hammered against the cracked windows as Daniel stood alone in the burned-out kitchen, staring at the journal lying open on the table. The ink on the pages had bled slightly from the moisture that had crept through the house, yet the words were still legible, sharp, deliberate strokes of someone who had written in anger, maybe desperation. "If you're reading this," the first line said, "then you already know I didn't leave by choice." His throat tightened. The handwriting belonged to his mother. She died 12 years ago, the night the fire consumed half the house. Or so he thought. The coroner had said the flames left nothing identifiable. But this book, had been found hidden behind a false wall in the attic when the contractors began repairs last month. The envelope tucked inside bore today's date. Her name was written on it in that same careful script. His hands trembled as he opened it. "Daniel," the letter began. "If they told you I was dead, they lied. They burned what they had to so no one would ask questions. The truth is in this journal, but it's not complete here. It's somewhere else. Somewhere you'll have to find." He sat down, pulse roaring in his ears. The smell of damp ashes still clung to the air, as if the fire had never left. He flipped through the journal's first pages, entries dated months before the fire, describing secret meetings, whispers about money, property, and betrayal among people with his family's names. Then, abruptly, the tone shifted. "They're watching," one entry read. "Every day feels like a test. I've hidden the rest where no one will think to look, in the house across the road, under the floorboards where the light never reaches." He froze. The house across the road had been abandoned since the fire, its windows boarded, its yard overgrown. Nobody had lived there in decades. Lightning flashed, illuminating the street through the broken blinds. He could see it now, the dark silhouette of that other house, like a reflection of his own grief. He remembered his mother standing at the window once, staring at it as if waiting for someone to come out. That night, she told him not to go near it. Some things are meant to stay buried, Danny. He hadn't understood then. But now, reading her words, he knew that whatever she'd hidden there wasn't meant to be found. Yet she'd left the clue anyway. He closed the journal and grabbed his flashlight. The storm outside seemed almost theatrical, as if the world was warning him to stop. But curiosity and guilt outweighed fear. He crossed the street, boots sinking into the soaked grass, wind howling like something alive. The boards on the front door were loose enough that he could pry them apart. Inside, the air was thick with dust and rot. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating what had once been furniture, now just shapes covered in mildew and cobwebs. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like footsteps behind him. He moved toward the corner of the living room, where the floorboards looked uneven, swollen by years of neglect. The journal's words replayed in his mind. Under the floorboards where the light never reaches. He knelt, set down the flashlight, and pried at the planks with a rusted crowbar he'd found by the doorway. After a few minutes, one of the boards snapped free, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside was a metal box. His breath caught. He reached for it, but as he did, something cold brushed his hand. He jerked back, the flashlight tumbling into the dark hole, its light spinning across the walls. The shape of a handprint appeared briefly on the dusty floor, small, almost childlike, before fading away. Heart pounding, Daniel forced himself to reach into the hole again and pull the box free. It was heavier than expected, sealed with a simple lock. He carried it to the window, cracked open the latch, and used a shard of broken glass to force the lock open. Inside were more pages, torn from what looked like the same journal, and a small cassette tape labeled simply, "Do not trust him." Beneath the tape lay a photograph. His mother stood beside a man Daniel didn't recognize, tall, smiling, with his hand on her shoulder. Behind them was this very house, before it had decayed. On the back of the photo, written in his mother's hand, "This is where it began." He turned the cassette over in his hand. He hadn't seen a tape player in years, but he knew his mother's old stereo still sat in the basement of his own house. As he crossed back through the storm, lightning illuminated the street again, and this time, he swore he saw a figure standing at the window of the abandoned house, watching him leave. When he blinked, it was gone. Back inside, he wiped the water from his face, hands shaking as he found the stereo under a tarp. He inserted the tape and pressed play. Static. Then, faintly, her voice. "Danny, if you're hearing this, I need you to listen carefully. The man in the photograph isn't who you think he is. He's the one who started the fire. He's the reason I had to disappear." The tape crackled. "They'll tell you I was unstable, that I imagined everything. But I've kept the proof. You just have to be brave enough to see it. Don't go to the police. Don't trust anyone from the family. Especially not." A burst of static drowned out the rest. Daniel hit pause, rewound, tried again, but the tape jammed halfway through. The stereo clicked, then went silent. His reflection in the basement window looked older, harder. He felt the weight of the journal, the box, the photograph, all pointing to a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Upstairs, the wind banged the shutters. And somewhere beyond that sound, faintly, he thought he heard a door creak open. Daniel froze. The sound wasn't the storm. It came from upstairs, slow and deliberate, like someone walking across the landing. He stood perfectly still, pulse hammering in his throat, listening. Another creak. Then silence. He looked at the tape recorder again, as if it might offer an explanation, but it sat motionless, the cassette half ejected, the tape inside slightly tangled. "Don't trust anyone from the family," his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Especially not who. He grabbed a hammer from the basement shelf and stepped quietly toward the stairs. The house was dark except for the faint flicker of lightning through the window, washing the walls in cold blue. Halfway up, a shadow moved across the hall, fast, human-shaped, and unmistakably real. Daniel's breath caught. "Hello," he called, voice breaking. No answer. He climbed the last few steps and turned the corner toward his mother's old room. The door was open, just a crack. He pushed it wider. The air smelled faintly of smoke and old perfume, like memory refusing to die. The curtains swayed slightly, though the window was closed. He stepped inside and raised the flashlight. There was no one there. Only the mirror, tall and cracked, reflecting his pale face back at him. Then he noticed something new. Fingerprints on the glass, smudged in the dust, smaller than his own. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch the glass, and his flashlight flickered. When it came back on, a faint outline appeared behind him in the reflection, a shape, standing in the doorway. He spun around, heart in his throat, but the hall was empty. He stayed frozen for several seconds before lowering the hammer. "Get a grip," he muttered. "You're just tired." But the words didn't sound convincing, even to him. He turned back to the mirror. Now the fingerprints were gone. The reflection showed only himself and the faint outline of the bed behind him. He forced himself to breathe, then went back downstairs, double-checking the locks. The storm had quieted outside, but the silence inside the house felt heavier. He sat at the kitchen table, spreading the journal pages across the wood. Each one was numbered except for a missing section, entries between March and May, the months leading up to the fire. Whatever was on those pages had been torn out. He remembered the hidden box, how the cassette and photo were there. But what if there had been more? Maybe someone had taken the rest. His mind turned to the name on the envelope, his own, and the way his mother had written. They burned what they had to. The realization hit him like cold water. What if the fire hadn't been an accident at all? He needed answers. He knew only one person who might know something. His Uncle Robert, the man who'd handled all the family's legal matters after the fire. He hadn't spoken to Robert in years, not since the fight over the inheritance. But if his mother's words were true, Robert was part of this. Daniel picked up his phone. It took several tries before his uncle answered, his voice rough with sleep. "Danny? It's late. What's wrong?" Daniel hesitated. "I found something," he said. "Something of Mom's. A journal." Silence. Then a slow inhale. "Where did you find it?" "In the house. Hidden behind the wall. And there's more. A tape. She said the fire wasn't an accident." The line crackled. "Daniel," Robert said quietly, "you shouldn't be digging into this. There are things you don't understand." "Then explain them to me," Daniel snapped. "What really happened? It's better if you let it go. For your own sake." "You knew, didn't you?" Daniel said, voice trembling. "You knew she didn't die in that fire." Another pause. "Meet me tomorrow," Robert said finally. "The cafe on Ridge Street, 9 o'clock. But, Daniel, don't bring that journal. Leave it where it is." The line went dead. Daniel set the phone down slowly. "Leave it where it is." He didn't like the way that sounded. He gathered the pages, stuffed them into a folder, and locked the box in the desk drawer. Upstairs, the wind picked up again, rattling the window frame. When he went to close it, he saw something strange, footprints in the mud outside, leading up to the house. They hadn't been there before. 2 sets of them. One small, one larger. The smaller one stopped by the front door. He turned the lock again, just to be sure. The rest of the night passed without sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face from the photo, the forced smile, the shadow of fear behind her eyes. At dawn, the rain finally stopped. He left early for the cafe, the journal tucked safely under his arm despite his uncle's warning. The streets were slick with puddles, the town half awake. When he arrived, Robert was already there, sitting by the window with a newspaper folded in front of him. He looked older than Daniel remembered, gray at the temples, heavier, but his eyes were sharp. "You came," Robert said. "You didn't sound like I had a choice." Robert motioned for him to sit. "I told you to leave the journal. And I told you I wasn't doing that." Daniel placed it on the table between them. Robert sighed, glancing around the cafe. "You have no idea what kind of trouble you're walking into. Your mother was obsessed with things that should have stayed buried." "She was scared," Daniel said. "She said someone started the fire." Robert's jaw tightened. "Did she tell you who?" "No. The tape cut off before she could." "Then be thankful," Robert muttered. "You're better off not knowing." Daniel leaned forward. "She mentioned proof. What did she mean?" Robert's expression changed. Something like guilt flickered in his eyes. "There was another book. A second journal. She called it the Ledger. Said it held the names of everyone involved." "Involved in what?" Robert hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Your mother got mixed up in something she shouldn't have. Family money, properties, debts that weren't supposed to exist on paper. She found out, and she tried to expose it. But there were people who wouldn't let that happen. People in our family," Daniel said slowly. Robert didn't answer. "Where's the second journal?" "Gone. Burned with everything else." Daniel studied his uncle's face. "You don't sound sure of that." "Because I'm not," Robert said, meeting his gaze. "And if it still exists, you need to stay far away from it. Promise me, Daniel." "I can't," Daniel said quietly. "I need to know the truth." Robert exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Then at least listen to this. You're not the only one looking for it." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Robert's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's someone else. A woman. She's been asking about your mother for years. Said she used to work for her. If she finds you, don't tell her what you've found. She's not who she says she is." Daniel sat back, uneasy. What's her name? She calls herself Elise. Lightning flashed again outside, though the storm had already passed. Robert folded his newspaper and stood. If you really want answers, go to the old storage unit on Millstone Avenue. That's where your mother kept everything before she vanished. But be careful, Daniel. Some truths don't forgive curiosity. He walked out before Daniel could say another word, leaving a half-empty cup of coffee behind. Daniel sat there, staring at the journal, his reflection in the window fractured by raindrops. For the first time, he realized he might not just be chasing ghosts. He might be walking straight into the same trap that had taken her.